Hello, my friends. It's Indiana Holmes for story time. Today we begin a new novel. Today's novel is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. We begin with Part 1, Chapter 1, A Shifting Reef. The year 1866 was signalized by a remarkable incident, a mysterious and puzzling phenomenon, which doubtless no one has yet forgotten, not to mention rumors which agitated the maritime population and excited the public mind, even in the interior of the continents. Seafaring men were patiently excited, merchants, common sailors, captains of vessels, skippers, both of Europe and America, naval officers of all continents and countries, and the governments of several states on the two continents were deeply interested in the matter. For some time, vessels had been met by an enormous thing, a long object, spindle-shaped, occasionally phosphorescent, and infinitely larger and more rapid in its movements than a whale. The facts relating to this apparition, entered in various logbooks, agreed in most respects as to the shape of the object or creature in question, the untiring rapidity of its movements, its surprising power of locomotion, and the peculiar life with which it seemed endowed. If it was a cetacean, it surpassed in size all those hitherto classified in science. Taking into consideration the mean of observations made by divers at times, rejecting the timid estimate of those who assigned to this object a length of 200 feet, equally with the exaggerated opinions which set it down as a mile in width and 3 in length, we might fairly conclude that this mysterious being surpassed greatly all dimensions admitted by ichthyologists of the day, if it existed at all. And that it did exist was an undeniable fact, and with that tendency which disposes the human mind in favor of the marvelous, we can understand the excitement produced in the entire world by this supernatural apparition. As to classing it in the list of fables, the idea was out of the question. On the 20th of July, 1866, the steamer Governor Higginson of the Calcutta and Burnetch Steam Navigation Company had met this moving mass 5 miles off the east coast of Australia. Captain Baker thought at first that he was in the presence of an unknown sandbank. He even prepared to determine its exact position, when 2 columns of water, projected by the inexplicable object, shot with a hissing noise 150 feet into the air. Now, unless the sandbank had been submitted to the intermittent interruption of a geyser, the Governor Higginson had to do neither more nor less than an aquatic mammal, unknown till then, which threw up from its blowholes columns of water mixed with air and vapor. Similar facts were observed on the 23rd of July in the same year in the Pacific Ocean by the Columbus of the West India and Pacific Steam Navigation Company. But this extraordinary cetaceous creature could transport itself from one place to another with surprising velocity, as in an interval of 3 days. The Governor Higginson and the Columbus had observed it at 2 different points on the chart, separated by a distance of more than 700 nautical leagues. 15 days later, 2,000 miles farther off, the Helvetia, the Compagnie Nationale, and the Shannon of the Royal Mail Steamship Company, sailing to windward in that portion of the Atlantic lying between the United States and Europe, respectively signaled the monster to each other in 42 degrees by 15 north latitude and 60 degrees by 35 west longitude. In these simulations, in these simultaneous observations, they thought themselves justified in estimating the minimum length of the mammal at more than 350 feet, as the Shannon and Helvetia were of smaller dimensions than it, though they measured 350 feet overall. Now the largest whales, those which frequent those parts of the sea round the Aleutian, Quilliamack, and Umglich Islands, have never exceeded the length of 60 yards, if they attain that. These reports arriving one after another, with fresh observations made on board the transatlantic ship Perrier, a collision which occurred between the Etna and the Inman line and the monster, a procès verbal directed by the officers of the French frigate Normandy, a very accurate survey made by the staff of Commodore Fitz James on board the Lord Clyde, greatly influenced public opinion. Light-thinking people jested upon the phenomena, but gave practical countries, such as England, America, and Germany, treated the matter more seriously. In every place of great resort, the monster was the fashion. They sang of it in the cafes, ridiculed it in the papers, and represented it on the stage. All kinds of stories were circulated regarding it. There appeared in the papers caricatures of every gigantic and imaginary creature, from the white whale, the terrible Moby Dick of Hyperborean regions, to the immense kraken whose tentacles could entangle a ship of 500 tons and hurry into the abyss of the ocean. The legends of ancient times were even resuscitated, and the opinions of Aristotle and Pliny revived, who admitted existence of these monsters, as well as the Norwegian tales of Bishop Pompedian, the accounts of Paul Heged, and, last of all, the reports of Harrington, whose good faith no one could suspect, who affirmed that, being on board the Castilian in 1857, he had seen this enormous serpent, which had never until that time frequented any other seas but those of the ancient Constitutionnel. Then burst forth the interminable controversy between the credulous and the incredulous in the societies of savants and the scientific journals. The question of the monster inflamed all minds. Editors of science journals, quarreling with believers in the supernatural, spilled seas of ink during this memorable campaign, some even drawing blood, for from the sea serpent they came to direct personalities. For 6 months war raged with various fortune in the leading articles of the Geographical Institution of Brazil, the Royal Academy of Science in Berlin, the British Association, the Smithsonian Institution of Washington, in the discussions of the Indian Arpeggio, of the Cosmos of the Abbe Mongo, in the Michuen of Petermann, in the scientific chronicles of the great journals of France and other countries. The cheaper journals replied keenly with the inexhaustible zest. These satirical writers parodied a remarkable Linnaeus, quoted by the adversaries of the monsters, maintaining that the mature did not make fools, and adjured that contemporaries could not give the lie to nature by admitting the existence of krakens, sea serpents, Moby Dicks, and other lubrications of delirious sailors. At length, an article in a well-known satirical journal by a favorite contributor, the chief of staff, settled the monster, like Hippolytus, giving in the death blow amidst an universal burst of laughter. Wit had conquered science. During the first months of the year of 1867, the question seemed buried, never to revive. When the new facts were brought before the public, it was then no longer a scientific problem to be solved, but a real danger seriously to be avoided. The question took quite another shape. The monster became a small island, A rock, a reef, but a reef of indefinite and shifting proportions. On the 5th of March, 1867, the Moravian of the Montreal Ocean Company, finding herself during the night in 27 degrees by 30 degrees latitude and 72 degrees by 15 feet longitude, struck on her starboard quarter a rock, marked in no chart for that part of the sea. Under the combined efforts of the wind and its 400 horsepower, it was going at a rate of 13 knots. Had it not been for the superior strength of the hull of that Moravian, she would have been broken by the shock and gone down with 237 passengers she was bringing home from Canada. The accident happened about 5 o'clock in the morning as the day was breaking. The officers of the quarterdeck hurried to the after part of the vessel. They examined the sea with the most scrupulous attention. They saw nothing but a strong eddy about 3 cables' length distant, as if the surface had been violently agitated. The bearings of the place were taken exactly, and the Moravian continued its route without apparent damage. Had it struck on a submerged rock or an enormous wreck? They could not tell. But the examination of the ship's bottom when undergoing repairs, it was found that part of the keel was broken. This fact, so gave in itself, might perhaps have been forgotten like many others, if 3 weeks after it had not been reenacted under similar circumstances. But thanks to the nationality of the victim of the shock, thanks to the reputation of the company to which the vessel belonged, the circumstance became extensively circulated. The 13th of April, 1867, the sea being beautiful, the breeze favorable, the Scotia of the Cunard Company's line found herself in 15 degrees by 12 degrees latitude and 45 degrees by 37 degrees latitude. She was going at a speed of 13 knots and a half. At 17 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, whilst the passengers were assembled at lunch in the great salon, a slight shock was felt on the hull of the Scotia. On her quarter, a little aft of the port paddle, the Scotia had not struck, but had been struck seemingly by something rather sharp and penetrating than blunt. The shock had been so slight that no one had been alarmed, had it not been for the shouts of the carpenter's watch, who rushed on to the bridge exclaiming, "We are sinking! We are sinking!" At first the passengers were much frightened, but the Captain Anderson hastened to reassure them. The danger could not be imminent. The Scotia, divided into 7 compartments by stronger partitions, could brave with impunity any leak. Captain Anderson went down immediately into the hold. He found that the sea was pouring into the 5th compartment, and the capacity of the influx proved that the force of the water was considerable. Fortunately, this compartment did not hold the boilers, or the fires would have been immediately extinguished. Captain Anderson ordered the engines to be stopped at once, and one of the men went down to ascertain the extent of the injury. Some minutes afterwards, they discovered the existence of a large hole of 2 yards in diameter in the ship's bottom. Such a leak could not be stopped, and the Scotia, her paddles half submerged, was obliged to continue her course. She was then 300 miles from Cape Clear, and after 3 days' delay, which caused a great uneasiness in Liverpool, she entered the basin of the company. The engineers visited the Scotia, which was put in dry dock. They could scarcely believe it possible. At 2 yards and a half below the water mark was a regular rent in the form of an isosceles triangle. The broken place in the iron plates was so perfectly defined that it could not have been more neatly done by a punch. It was clear, then, that the instrument producing the perforation was not of common stamp, and after having been driven with prodigious strength and piercing an iron plate of 1 3/4 inches thick, had withdrawn itself by a retrograde motion, truly inexplicable. Such was the last fact which resulted in exciting once more the torrent of public opinion. From this moment, all unlucky casualties, which could have not been otherwise accounted for, were put down to the monster. Upon this imaginary creature rested the responsibility of all these shipwrecks, which unfortunately were very considerable, for 3,000 ships, whose loss was annually recorded at Lloyd's, the number of sailing and steamships supposed to be totally lost from the absence of all news amounted to not less than 200. Now it was the monster who, justly or unjustly, was accused of their disappearance, and, thanks to it, communication between the different continents became more and more dangerous. The public demanded peremptorily that the seas should at any price be relieved from this formidable cetacean. Chapter 2. Pro and Con. At the period when these events took place, I had just returned from a scientific research in the disagreeable territory of Nebraska in the United States. In virtue of my office as assistant professor in the Museum of Natural History in Paris, the French government had attached me to that expedition. After 6 months in Nebraska, I arrived in New York towards the end of March, laden with a precious collection. My departure for France was fixed for the first day in May. Meanwhile, I was occupying myself in classifying my mineralogical, botanical, and zoological riches, when the accident happened to the Scotia. I was perfectly up in the subject, which was the question of the day. How could I be otherwise? I had read and reread all the American and European papers without being any nearer a conclusion. This mystery puzzled me. Under the impossibility of forming an opinion, I jumped from one extreme to the other. That there really was something could not be doubted, and the incredulousness was invited to put their finger on the wound of the Scotia. On my arrival in New York, the question was at its height. The hypothesis of the floating island and the unapproachable sandbank, supported by minds little competent to form a judgment, was abandoned. And indeed, unless this shoal had a machine in its stomach, how could it change its position with such astonishing rapidity? From the same cause, the idea of a floating hull of an enormous wreck was given up. There remained then only two possible solutions of the question, which created two distinct parties. On one side, those who were for a monster of colossal strength. On the other, those who were for a submarine vessel of enormous motive power. But this last hypothesis, plausible as it was, could not stand all inquiries made in both worlds. That a private gentleman should have such a machine at his command was not likely. Where, when, and how was it built? And how could its construction have been kept a secret? Certainly a government might possess such a destructive machine, and in these disastrous times, when the ingenuity of man was manipulated, the power of weapons of war, it was possible that, without the knowledge of others, a state might try to work such a formidable engine. After the chesspots came the torpedoes. From the torpedoes, the submarine rams. Then the reaction. At least, I hope so. But the hypothesis of a war machine fell before the declaration of the governments. As before, public interest was in question, and transatlantic communications suffered. Their veracity could not be doubted. But how admit that the construction of this submarine boat had escaped the public eye? For a private gentleman to keep the secret under such circumstances would be very difficult, and for a state whose every act is persistently watched by powerful rivals, certainly impossible. After inquiries made in England, France, Russia, Prussia, Spain, Italy, and America, even Turkey, the hypothesis of a submarine monitor was definitely rejected. Upon my arrival in New York, several persons did me the honor of consulting me on the phenomena in question. I had published in France a work in quarto, in 2 volumes, entitled Mysteries of the Great Submarine Grounds. This book, highly approved of in the learned world, gained for me a special reputation in this rather obscure branch of natural history. My advice was asked, as long as I could deny the reality of the fact. I confined myself to a decided negative, but soon, finding myself driven into a corner, I was obliged to explain myself categorically, and even the Honorable Pierre Arnault, professor in the Museum of Paris, was called upon by the New York Herald to express a definite opinion of some sort. I did something. I spoke for want of power to hold my tongue. I discussed the question in all of its forms, politically and scientifically, and I give here an extract from a carefully studied article which I published in the number of 30th April. It ran as follows. After examining one by one the different hypotheses, rejecting all other suggestions, it becomes necessary to admit the existence of a marine animal of enormous power. The great depths of the ocean are entirely unknown to us. Soundings cannot reach them. What passes in those remote depths, what beings live or can live 12 or 15 miles beneath the surface of the water? What is the organization of these animals? We can scarcely conjecture. However, the solution of the problem submitted to me may modify the form of the dilemma. Either we do not know all the varieties of the beings which people our planet, or we do not. If we do not know them all, if nature has still secrets in its etiology, for us, nothing is more comfortable to reason than to admit the existence of fishes or cetaceans of other kinds, or even of a new species, of an organization formed by the habit of the strata inaccessible to its surroundings, and which, an accident of some sort, either vestigial or capricious, has brought at long intervals to upper levels of the ocean. If, on the contrary, if, on the contrary, we do not know all living kinds, we must necessarily seek for the animal in question amongst those marine beings already classed, and in that case, I should be disposed to admit the existence of a gigantic narwhal. The common narwhal, or unicorn of the sea, often attains a length of 60 feet. Increase its size 5-fold or 10-fold, give it the strength proportionate to its size, lengthen its destructive weapons, and you obtain the animal required. It will have the proportions determined by the officers of the Shannon, the instrument required by the perforation of the Scotia, and the power necessary to pierce the hull of the steamer. Indeed, the narwhal is armed with a sort of ivory sword, a halberd, according to the expression of certain naturalists. The principal tusk has the hardness of steel. Some of these tusks have been found buried in the bodies of whales, which the unicorn always attacks with success. Others have been drawn out, not without trouble, from the bottoms of ships, which they had pierced through and through, as a gimlet pierces a barrel. The Museum of the Faculty of Medicine of Paris possesses one of these defensive weapons, 2 yards and a quarter in length and 15 inches in diameter at the base. Very well, suppose this weapon to be 6 times stronger and the animal 10 times more powerful. Launch it at a rate of 20 miles an hour, and you probably obtain a shock capable of producing the catastrophe required. Until further information, therefore, I shall maintain it to be a seaborne unicorn, of colossal dimensions, armed not with a halberd, but with a real spur, as the armored frigates or the rams of the war, whose massiveness and motive power it would possess at the same time. Thus may this puzzling phenomena be explained, unless there be something over and above all that has ever been conjectured, seen, perceived, or experienced, which is just within the bounds of possibility. These last words were cowardly on my part, but up to a certain point I wished to shelter my dignity as professor and not give too much cause for laughter to the Americans, who laugh well when they do laugh. I reserved for myself a way of escape. In effect, however, I admitted the existence of the monster. My article was warmly discussed, which procured in a high reputation. It rallied round its certain number of partisans. The solution it proposed gave at least full liberty to the imagination. The human mind delights in grand conceptions of supernatural beings, and the sea is precisely their best vehicle, the only medium through which these giants, against which terrestrial animals such as elephants or rhinoceroses are as nothing, can be produced or developed. The industrial and commercial papers treated the question chiefly from this point of view. The Shipping and Mercantile Gazette, the Lloyd's List, the Packet Boat, and the Maritime and Colonial Review, all papers devoted to insurance companies which threatened to raise their rates of premium, were unanimous at this point. Public opinion had been pronounced. The United States were the first in the field, and in New York they made preparations for an expedition destined to pursue the narwhal. A frigate of great speed, the Abraham Lincoln, was put in commission as soon as possible. The arsenals were opened to the commander Farragut, who hastened the arming of his frigate. But as it always happens, the moment it was decided to pursue the monster did not appear. For 2 months no one had heard it spoken of. No ship met with it. It seemed as if this unicorn knew of the plots weaving round it. It had been so much talked of, even through the Atlantic cable, that jesters pretended that this slender fly had stopped a telegram on its passage and was making the most of it. So when the frigate had been armed for a long campaign and provided with formidable fishing apparatus, no one could tell what course to pursue. Impatience grew apace when, on the 2nd of July, they learned that the steamer of the line of San Francisco from California to Shanghai had seen the animal 3 weeks before in the North Pacific Ocean. The excitement caused by this news was extreme. The ship was reviculated and well stocked with coal. 3 hours before Abraham Lincoln left the Brooklyn Pier, I received a letter worded as follows: To Mr. Arnox, Professor of the Museum of Paris, 5th Avenue Hotel, New York. Sir, if you will consent to join the Abraham Lincoln in this expedition, the government of the United States will with pleasure see France represented in the enterprise. Commander Farragut has a cabin at your disposal. Very cordially yours, J.B. Hobson, Secretary of the Marine. Chapter 3. I inform my resolution. 3 seconds before the arrival of J.B. Hobson's letter, I no more thought of pursuing the Unicorn than of attempting the passage of the North Sea. 3 seconds after reading the letter of the Honorable Secretary of Marine, I felt that my true vocation, the sole end of my life, was to chase this disturbing monster and purge it from the world. But I had just returned from a fatiguing journey, weary and longing for repose. I aspired to nothing more than again seeing my country, my friends, my little lodging by the Jardin des Plantes, my dear and precious collections. But nothing could keep me back. I forgot all, fatigue, friends, and collections, and accepted without hesitation the offer of the American government. Besides, I thought, all roads lead back to Europe for my particular benefit, and I will not hurry me towards the coast of France. This worthy animal may allow itself to be caught in the seas of Europe for my particular benefit, and I will not bring back less than half a yard of its ivory halberd to the Museum of Natural History. But in the meanwhile, I must seek this narwhal in the North Pacific Ocean, which, to return to France, was taking the road to Antipodes. Conseil, I called in impatient voice. Conseil was my servant, a true, devoted Flemish boy who had accompanied me in all my travels. I liked him, and he returned the liking well. He was phlegmatic by nature, regular from principle, zealous from habit, evincing little disturbance at the different surprises of life. Very quick with his hands and apt at any service required of him, and, despite his name, never giving advice, even when asked for it. Conseil had followed me for the last 10 years wherever science led. Never once did he complain of the length of or fatigue of a journey. Never make an objection to pack his portmanteau for whatever country it might be, or however far away, whether China or Congo. Besides all this, he had good health, which defied all sickness, and solid muscles, but no nerves. Good morals are understood. This boy was 30 years old, and his age to that of his master as 15 to 20. May I be excused for saying that I was 40 years old. But Conseil had one fault. He was ceremonious to a degree, and would never speak to me but in the third person, which was sometimes provoking. Conseil, said I again, beginning with feverish hands to make preparations for my departure. Certainly I was sure of this devoted boy. As a rule, I never asked him if it were convenient for him or not to follow me on my travels, but this time the expedition in question might be prolonged, and the enterprise might be hazardous in pursuit of an animal capable of sinking a frigate as easily as a nutshell. Here there was matter for reflection, even to the most impassible man in the world. What would Conseil say? Conseil, I recalled a third time. Conseil appeared. Did you call, sir? Said he, entering. Yes, my boy. Make preparations for me, and for yourself too. We leave in 2 hours. As you please, sir, replied Conseil quietly. Not an instant to lose. Lock in my trunk all traveling utensils, coats, shirts, stockings, without counting, as many as you can, and make haste. And your collections, sir, observed Conseil. We will think of them by and by. What? The Architherium? The Hacrotherium? The Ordians? The Cheropotamus? And the other skins? They will keep at the hotel. And your live Barbarossa, sir? They will feed it during our absence. Besides, I will give orders to forward our menagerie to France. We are not returning to Paris, then? Said Conseil. No, certainly no, I answered evasively by making a curve. Will the curve please you, sir? Oh, it will be nothing. Not quite so direct a road. That is all. We take our passage in the Abraham Lincoln. As you think proper, sir, coolly, replied Conseil. You see, my friend, it has to do with the monster, the famous narwhal. We are going to purge it from the seas. The author of a work in quarto in 2 volumes on the mysteries of the great submarine grounds cannot forbear embarking with Commander Farragut. A glorious mission, but a dangerous one. We cannot tell where we go. These animals can be very capricious, but we will go whether or no we have got a captain who is pretty wide awake. I opened a credit account for Barbarossa, and, Conseil following, I jumped into a cab. Our luggage was transported to the deck of the frigate immediately. I hastened on board and asked for Commander Farragut. One of the sailors conducted me to the poop, where I found myself in the presence of a good-looking officer who held out his hand to me. Monsieur Pierre Aronnax, said he. Himself, I replied. Commander Farragut? You are welcome, Professor. Your cabin is ready for you. I bowed and desired to be conducted to the cabin destined for me. The Abraham Lincoln had been well chosen and equipped for her new destination. She was a frigate of great speed, fitted with high-pressure engines which admitted a pressure of 7 atmospheres. Under this, the Abraham Lincoln attained a mean speed of nearly 18 knots and a third of an hour, a considerable speed, but nevertheless insufficient to grapple with this gigantic cetacean. The interior arrangements of the frigate corresponded to its nautical qualities. I was well satisfied with my cabin, which was, in after part, opening upon the gun-room. We shall be well off here, said I to Conseil. As well, by your honour's leave, as a hermit crab in the shell of a whelk, said Conseil. I left Conseil to stow our trunks conveniently away, and remounted the poop in order to survey the preparations for our departure. At that moment, Commander Farragut was ordering the last moorings to be cut loose, which held the Abraham Lincoln to the pier in Brooklyn. So, in a quarter of an hour, perhaps less, the frigate would have sailed without me. I should have missed this extraordinary, supernatural, and incredible expedition, the recital of which may well meet with some skepticism. But Commander Farragut would not lose a day, nor an hour, in the scouring of the seas in which the animal had been sighted. He sent for the engineer. Is the steam full on? He asked. Yes, sir, replied the engineer. Go ahead, cried Commander Farragut. The quay of Brooklyn, and all that part of New York bordering on the East River, was crowded with spectators. 3 cheers burst successfully from 500,000 throats. Thousands of handkerchiefs were waved, and above the heads of the compact mass, saluting the Abraham Lincoln, until she reached the waters of the Hudson. At the point of that elongated peninsula which forms the town of New York, then the frigate, following the coast of New Jersey, along the right bank of the beautiful river, covered with villas, passed between the forts, which saluted her with their heaviest guns. The Abraham Lincoln answered by hoisting the American colors 3 times, whose 39 stars shone resplendent from the mizzen peak. When modifying its speed, took the narrow channel marked by buoys placed on the inner bay formed by Sandy Hook Point. It coasted the long sandy beach, where some thousands of spectators gave it one final cheer. The escort of the boats and tenders still followed the frigate, and did not leave her until they came abreast of the lightship, whose 2 lights marked the entrance of the New York Channel. 6 bells struck. The pilot got into his boat and rejoined the little schooner, which was waiting under our lee. The fires were made up, the screw beat the waves rapidly. The frigate skirted the low yellow coast of the Long Island, and at 8 bells, after having lost sight in the northwest of the lights of Fire Island, she ran at full steam on to the dark waters of the Atlantic. Chapter 4. Ned Land. Captain Farragut was a good seaman, worthy of the frigate he commanded. His vessel and he were one. He was the soul of it. On the question of the cetacean, there was no doubt in his mind, and he would not allow the existence of the animal to be disputed on board. He believed in it, as certain good women believe in the Leviathan, by faith, not by reason. The monster did exist, and he had sworn to rid the seas of it. He was a kind of Knight of Rhodes, a second Dudonde de Gozon, going to meet the serpent which desolated the island. Either Captain Farragut would kill the narwhal, or the narwhal would kill the captain. There was no third course. The officers on board shared the opinion of their chief. They were ever chatting, discussing, and calculating the various chances of a meeting, watching narrowly the vast surface of the ocean. More than one took up the quarters voluntarily in the cross trees. One would have cursed such a berth under any other circumstances. As long as the sun described its daily course, the rigging was crowded with sailors, whose feet were burnt to such an extent by the heat of the deck as to render it unbearable. Still, the Abraham Lincoln had not yet breasted the suspected waters of the Pacific. As the ship's company, they desired nothing better than to meet the Unicorn, to harpoon it, hoist it on board, and dispatch it. They watched the sea with eager attention. Besides, Captain Farragut had spoken of a certain sum of $2,000 set apart for whoever should first sight the monster, were he cabin boy, common seaman, or officer. I leave you to judge how eyes were used on board the Abraham Lincoln. For my part, I was not behind the others, and I left no one my share of daily observations. The frigate might have been called the Argus for 100 reasons. Only one amongst us, Conseil, seemed to protest by his indifference against the question which has interested us all, and seemed to be out of keeping with the general enthusiasm on board. I have said that Captain Farragut had carefully provided his ship with every apparatus for catching the gigantic cetacean. No whaler had ever been better armed. We possessed every known engine, from the harpoon thrown by hand to the barbed arrows of the blunderbuss and the explosive balls of the duck gun. On the forecastle lay the perfection of a breech loading gun, very thick at the breech and very narrow at the bore, the model of which had been in the exhibition of 1867. This precious weapon of American origin could throw with ease a conical projectile of 9 pounds to mean distance of 10 miles. Thus the Abraham Lincoln wanted for no means of destruction, and, what was better still, she had on board Ned Land, the prince of harpooners. Ned Land was a Canadian, with an uncommon quickness of the hand, and who knew no equal in his dangerous occupation. Skill, coolness, audacity, and cunning he possessed in a superior degree, and he must have been a cunning whale or a singularly cute shallot to escape the stroke of his harpoon. Ned Land was about 40 years of age. He was a tall man, more than 6 feet high, strongly built, grave and taciturn, occasionally violent, and very passionate about when contradicted. His person attracted attention, but above all the boldness of his look, which gave a singular expression to his face. Who calls himself Canadian, calls himself French, and in a little communication as Ned Land was, I must admit that he took a certain liking for me. My nationality drew me to him, for, no doubt, it was an opportunity for him to talk and for me to hear that old language of rebellious, which is still in use in some Canadian provinces. The harpooner's family was originally from Quebec and was already a tribe of hardy fishermen when this town belonged to France. Little by little, Ned Land acquired a taste for chatting, and I loved to hear the recital of his adventures in the polar seas. He related his fishing and his combats with a natural poetry of expression. His recital took the form of an epic poem, and I seemed to be listening to a Canadian Homer singing the Iliad of the regions of the north. I am portraying this hardy companion as I really knew him. He and I are old friends now, united in that unchangeable friendship which is born and cemented amidst extreme dangers. Ah, brave Ned, I ask no more than to live 100 years longer, that I may have more time to dwell and longer on your memory. Now, what was Ned Land's opinion upon the question of the marine monster? I must admit that he did not believe in the unicorn, and was the only one on board who did not share that universal conviction. He even avoided the subject, which I one day thought my duty to press upon him. One magnificent evening, the 30th of July, that is to say, 3 weeks after our departure, the frigate was abreast of Cape Blanc, 30 miles to leeward of the coast of Patagonia. We had crossed the Tropic of Capricorn and the Straits of Magellan, opened less than 700 miles to the north. Before 8 days were over, the Abraham Lincoln would be plowing the waters of the Pacific. Seated on the poop, Ned Land and I were chatting of one thing after another as we looked at the mysterious sea, whose great depths had up to this time been inaccessible to the human eye. I naturally led up the conversation to the giant unicorn and examined the various chances of success or failure of the expedition. But seeing that Ned let me speak without saying too much himself, I pressed him more closely. Well, Ned, I said, is it possible that you are not convinced of the existence of the cetacean that we are following? Have you any particular reason for being so incredulous? The harpooner looked at me fixedly for some moments before answering, struck his broad forehead with his hand, and habit of his, by the way, as if to collect himself, and said at last, "Perhaps I have, Monsieur Arnox. But, Ned, you, a whaler by profession, familiarized with all the great marine mammalia, you, whose imagination might easily accept the hypothesis of enormous cetaceans, you ought to be able to at least doubt under such circumstances." "That is just what deceives you, Professor," replied Ned, "that the vulgar should believe in extraordinary comets traversing space, and in the existence of antediluvian monsters in the heart of the globe. May well be, but neither astronomer nor geologist believes in such chimeras. As a whaler, I have followed many a cetacean, harpooned a great number, and killed several. But however strong or well armed they may have been, neither their tails nor their weapons could have been able to scratch the iron plates of a steamer. But, Ned, they tell of ships which the teeth of the narwhal have pierced through and through." "Wooden ships, that is possible," replied the Canadian, "but I have never seen it done, and until further proof, I deny that whales, cetaceans, or sea unicorns could ever produce the effect you describe." "Well, Ned, I repeat it with conviction. Resting on the logic of facts, I believe in the existence of a mammal powerfully organized, belonging to the branch of the vertebra, like the whales and the shallots or the dolphins,
and furnished with a horn of defense of great penetrating power. Said the harpooner, shaking his head with an air of a man who would not be convinced. Notice one thing, my worthy Canadian, I resumed. If such an animal is in existence, if in its habits the depths of the ocean, if it frequents the strata lying miles below the surface of the water, it must necessarily possess an organization of strength, of which would defy all comparison. And why this powerful organization? Demanded Ned. But it requires incalculable strength to keep one's self in these strata and resist their pressure. Listen to me. Let us admit that the pressure of the atmosphere is represented by the weight of the column of water 32 feet high. In reality, the column of water would be shorter, as we are speaking of seawater, the density of which is greater than that of fresh water. Very well, when you dive, Ned, as many as 32 feet of water as there are above you, so many times does your body bear the pressure equal to that of the atmosphere. That is to say, 15 pounds for each square inch of surface. It follows then that at 320 feet, this pressure equals that of 10 atmospheres, of 100 atmospheres at 3,200 feet, and 1,000 atmospheres at 32,000 feet. That is about 6 miles, which is equivalent to saying that if you could attain this depth in the ocean, each square 3/8 of an inch of surface of your body would bear a pressure of 5,600 pounds. Ah, my brave Ned, do you know how many square inches you carry on the surface of your body? I have no idea, Monsieur Arnox. About 6,500. And, as in reality, the atmospheric pressure is about 15 pounds to the square inch of your 6,500 square inches, bearing at this moment a pressure of 97,500 pounds. Without your perceiving it, and if you are not crushed by such pressure, it is because the air penetrates the interior of your body with equal pressure, hence perfect equilibrium between the interior and the exterior, which thus neutralize each other, and which allows you to bear it without inconvenience. But in the water, it is another thing. Yes, I understand, said Ned, becoming more attentive. Because the water surrounds me, but does not penetrate me. Precisely, Ned, so that at 32 feet beneath the surface of the sea, you would undergo a pressure of 97,500 pounds. At 320 feet, 10 times that pressure. At 3,200 feet, 100 times that pressure. Lastly, at 32,000 feet, 1,000 times the pressure would be 97,500,000 pounds. That is to say, you would be flattened as if you had been drawn from the plates of a hydraulic machine. The devil! Exclaimed Ned. Very well, my worthy harpooner. If some vertebrate, several hundred yards long, with a very large in proportion, can maintain itself in such depths of those which surface is represented by millions of square inches, that is by tens of millions of pounds, we must estimate the pressure they undergo. Consider then what must be the resistance of their bony structure, the strength of their organization to withstand such pressure. Why, exclaimed Ned Land, they must be made of iron plates 8 inches thick, like the armored frigates. As you say, Ned, and think what destruction such a mass would have caused if hurled with the speed of an express train against the hull of a vessel. Yes, certainly, perhaps, replied the Canadian, shaken by these figures, but not yet willing to give in. Well, have I convinced you yet? You have convinced me of one thing, sir, which is that in such animals do exist at the bottom of the seas, they must necessarily be strong, as you say. But if they do not exist, my obstinate harpooner, How explain the accident of the Scotia? And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 4. Looks like these first 4 chapters are really setting up the question of, is this monster a mechanical invention of man, like some kind of extremely large submarine, or is it a manimal, like a cetacean, a whale, a dolphin, a narwhal? And if so, could it possibly have done the damage to a steel-hulled vessel such as the Scotia? Is it something just of the imagination of sailors, or is it real? Well, we will continue to find that out when we resume tomorrow night. Thank you for joining me. This has been Indiana Homes for Storytime. Good night.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notifications button. Thank you very much.